All right, so yeah, like I said, I want to start with sort of general, start talking just about mountain lion ecology in general, and then go into some of the more specifics about our research program. Let's see. Um, so first things first, just some basic facts about mountain lions. Around here, we tend to call them mountain lions, but in other places, you'll hear people refer to them as pumas or cougars. And it's all the same species. And so sometimes there's some confusion based on the names. And one of the sort of fun and interesting facts is that this is one of the species with the most colloquial names based on different regions. And so the folks, our research partners that work farther north from here are often referring to them as cougars, and refer to our project as the Puma Project, but it's all the same species. Um, And that species is super wide ranging. So it's the same species whether you're in Canada all the way down to the southern end of Argentina. So this is the species with the largest terrestrial range in the Western Hemisphere. Um, and and it's part of what makes them so remarkable and their ability to adapt to all the different habitats throughout that entire geographic area. Some more sort of basic ecology. These cats tend to be 70 to 150 pounds. Around here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we see that females are 80 to 100 pounds, and males tend to be 120 to 140 pounds. And pretty much all of their diet around here is consisting of deer. So they'll take some smaller prey items, but in terms of calories or just general biomass, almost 90% of that is black-tailed deer. And the territorial species, so they have these large home ranges. Female home ranges tend to be a little bit smaller. They're 20 to 30 square miles. And then males are 50 to 60 square miles. And the males are more competitive with each other, so they'll compete for their own territories and sort of box out other males, whereas they'll then overlap with several females. And we see that females tend to share habitat a little bit more, especially with their own offspring. And then in terms of litter size, we tend to see 1 to 4 kittens. Four is fairly uncommon in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We tend to see 1 to 3, and then there's fairly low survival rate for kittens. So even if there's a litter of 3 or 4, it's usually just 1 or 2 that are going to survive to adulthood. And in terms of the Puma project, our project was started back in 2008, and Chris Wilmers is our lead on the project. He started this project and he's a professor at UC Santa Cruz. And since then, we've been working throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains, basically from as far north as San Francisco, as far east as San Jose, and then down to Watsonville. And we use a variety of techniques that I'll get into in a minute, but really our interest is in how human activities affecting mountain lion movement and behavior. Um, and really, we're also really interested in connectivity. And so our population in the Santa Cruz Mountains tends to be fairly isolated from the adjacent mountain ranges. And that's sort of a common theme throughout California. And so this map on the right-hand side of the screen is a recent genetic analysis of the different mountain lions throughout the state. And so even though I said it was one species, when you start to dig into the genetics, we do see that there's some isolation amongst populations across the state. Um, and that really has to do with human infrastructure and really the lack of connectivity for cats to be able to leave the Santa Cruz Mountains and then connect to other populations, whether that's farther south or east. Um, and as a result of that, Fish and Wildlife is currently considering some of these coastal and southern populations um, for endangered species status. So that's sort of ongoing, but a lot of that work has been informed by our project, but also other projects throughout the state and this sort of genetic analysis of how connected they are. So some more basic ideas about why we study mountain lions and why this project really started from the beginning. Uh, we can think about mountain lions as this top predator in the system with both direct and indirect effects on their prey. So when I say direct effects, that's sort of direct consumption of black-tailed deer, but we also see that they have a fairly large effect a large indirect effect, not necessarily through consumption, but just their presence alone affects the behavior of other carnivores. So things like bobcats, foxes, skunks, raccoons are all shifting their behavior around mountain lion presence. Um, and that sort of trickles down the trophic level or throughout the ecosystem, and it can affect anything from small mammals all the way to the plant architecture. So we see that places where there's a healthy mountain lion population and they're preying on deer, then that ultimately can have an effect on the shrub and plant life in that area as well. And then some maybe like maybe some things that we don't think about as readily when we think about the effect of mountain lions. Some of our research has shown that the presence can also have an effect on disease dynamics and particularly Lyme's disease. And so because Lyme's disease has this intermediate host with ticks infecting or being transported by deer, we see that the presence of mountain lions and other predators really affects that life cycle. And in areas where we have healthier predator populations, there tends to be lower prevalence of Lyme's disease. And then lastly, there's also been some work showing the effect on deer vehicle collisions. And and so again, the presence of mountain lions can help reduce the deer populations or at least keep them in check. And that ultimately can then have this sort of socioeconomic impact and really health impact on humans in that it can create fewer collisions on highways. So now I kind of want to go over some of the tactics that we use in the Santa Cruz Mountains to be able to study mountain lions. We use a variety of techniques, but these are the primary ones. So we use GPS collars to track locations of individual mountain lions. We use camera traps to understand the ecology of uncollared lions, but also their prey populations and other mesocarnivores in the system. And then we're using genetics and general field observations to supplement those data sources. And so a question we get a lot is how do we actually catch a mountain lion? And there's sort of two ways that we do it. One is with cage traps or box traps, and we'll use roadkill deer as bait. And then we can use those bait to attract mountain lions. And then you'll see in this video sort of the general idea. But the mountain lion will be attracted to the bait, will go in the cage, and in the back of the cage, there's a foot pedal that ultimately closes that door behind them. And so then when we do this, we're camping nearby, and we'll arrive within 30 minutes. Essentially, someone on our team is checking throughout the night whether or not that trap is still open or not. And then we can use an anesthetic to tranquilize that mountain lion and put a collar on it and take some samples and do a workup. And so that's the first way. The second way is with dogs. And so we have a team of plot hounds that are trained specifically for mountain lions or on the scent of mountain lions. And I have another video that will show a little bit of what that looks like. So these dogs are trained specifically to sniff out the scent of mountain lions. You can see the mountain lion in the tree, fairly relaxed. Um, but yeah, the dogs are really nice because they do a lot of the work for us. And they're really good at what they do. And so mountain lions have evolved this response to dogs and other predators. We tend to use anywhere between 2 and 4.
Oh, that's all.
Yeah, and so you really don't need a lot. And even we can tree a mountain lion with a single dog. We tend not to want to do that, especially if it's a male lion. There could be a risk to the dog if it's just a single dog and a large male. But we've never had any issues with the cats turning on the dogs. And really, it comes down to these cats wanting to avoid these sort of stressful situations or potential conflict. And so it's much easier for them to realize that if they hear a dog, they can just go up a tree. They know the dog's not going to get to that tree. And so we can take advantage of that. And when the dogs tree the lion, then we can arrive and use a dart to then tranquilize the lion and do the same workup process where we take samples and put a collar on it. So then once we have the lion tranquilized, we do a variety of things, but primarily we're monitoring the health of that lion. So we'll take temperature, respiration, and heart rate every 10 minutes. We'll draw blood and take a skin sample for genetic analysis. We'll take some hair as well for genetics and hormone levels, so you can test the stress hormones of different lions based on those hair samples. And then we'll take measurements of the body of that lion as well as the teeth. The teeth measurements are particularly useful for aging a lion. So often you can tell how old a lion is based on the wear of their teeth as well as the color. Um, and then ultimately for a lot of these lions, we put a GPS collar on them. And so
The color of the mountain lion that was right by our front door was a lot more beige, very lighter color than that.
And so yeah, there's some variety in that coat color. They're sort of all that sort of tan beige color.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of people, we do get some questions about whether or not there's like with jaguars and with leopards, you can have a black color morph where they still have their spot patterns underneath that coat, but they appear to have black hair over top. That doesn't happen in mountain lions. There has been some like rare cases of albino mountain lions, but never around here. Okay, and so then we have these GPS collars, and with those collars, we're able to see the individual movement tracks of different lions. And ultimately, it sort of paints a picture like this. These are the home ranges of the cats that we monitored last year, so during 2024. And at any given time, our project tries to have 10 to 15 lions collared or active collars functioning on the landscape. And so last year we had about 20 cats collared total, but they're not necessarily all functioning at the same time. And one thing you can see from this map is that these, for one, the home ranges are extremely large and covering large areas, but we do see that the sex difference as well in the home range size. So a lot of the males have larger home ranges, and then they'll overlap with several females within that. Yeah.
Wait, so is that showing that basically here we have two cats and here now basically like
Yeah, so
um,
essentially, yeah, at least two collared cats, and there's probably more than that. Yeah.
Did just checking in real quick. I think sometimes people online aren't catching the questions that we have here. So what was your question?
Oh.
You got it? Did you get it? Okay. Emily, let us know if we're missing some questions. Okay, but we'll wait till the end most. Okay.
And so this sort of paints the picture of the data that we tend to get. We also have this camera grid, so we use camera traps that are motion censored, and they allow us to not only monitor collared mountain lions, but also uncollared cats. And then they have the advantage of being fairly non-invasive, so you don't have to actually catch the animal to get data on them. And they're giving us data not only on mountain lions, but also sort of the general, the broader ecological community. So we can see prey diversity as well as human diversity or human presence. And we start to ask questions about how do some of those factors affect whether or not a mountain lion uses that area. So this camera grid is a grid of almost 120 cameras that we've been putting out since 2015 for the springtime. And that gives us this longitudinal data set. So that just means we get to see change over time as well. So by monitoring since 2015, we can see not only how the mountain lion population has changed, but also how the prey populations have changed or how trail use has changed and things like that. And so ultimately, we want to combine all of these data sources, and we're asking questions that related to conservation and management, not only of mountain lions, but also of parks and of trail systems and of other species. So next, I want to show, this is a little bit of data as well. Basically, this is also GPS data. It's not the most up to date, so I apologize for that, but this is from 2023. And it just gives an idea of the types of movement that we get to see with these GPS collars. And so this allows us to ask lots of different questions, but also to understand a lot about mountain lion ecology. And so We can understand movement behavior, the different space use requirements of mountain lions. So coming up with those numbers of those home ranges or how much area or how much space an individual needs. This data helps us understand that. We can also better understand diet. So um, by looking at consecutive GPS points that fall in the same location, we can then go to those points and essentially, if the GPS is telling us that the mountain lion has stayed in the same spot, there's probably something interesting there. And so our team tries to go to those locations and see what's going on. More often than not, it's a deer that they've killed, and then we can keep track of what they're eating over time. And similarly, when we have collared lions near each other, we can think about interactions between collared lions. This is So this is another component of our data set. Each collar not only has a GPS on it, but it also has an accelerometer. And accelerometer data essentially tells us speed in all three directions. So whether it's forward and backwards, side to side, and also up and down. And by combining the GPS data with that accelerometer data, then we can also get at fine scale behaviors of those individuals without actually observing them or observing them remotely. So this is an example where we can see the different accelerometer signatures of different behaviors. So we can tell when an individual's eating, pouncing or attacking a prey item, moving slowly, moving quickly, resting. And so by combining those data sets, we can really get a fine scale look at what an individual's doing really throughout the entire day. So the other thing that these data are useful for and that we're particularly focused on right now is identifying these movement corridors. And so earlier I had mentioned that connectivity is sort of a big focus for our project right now and for a lot of projects at the state. And this really comes down to improving the connectivity, especially across highways and different barriers, essentially barriers that are created by human infrastructure. So this is an example of some of our data that contributed to informing the Laurel Curve underpass, which went in just a few years ago, and has since then been successful in allowing mountain lions, but also other species to pass underneath. And we're also excited that there's a similar project in the works. So if we look a little bit further north on this map, we see Laurel Curve sort of down here with all these green dots, but north of Lexington, there's another proposed overpass that will also improve connectivity across 17. And that's currently in the works with Mid-Penn and some other folks. And and yeah, a lot of this has been informed both by the GPS data, but also by vehicle collisions that we respond to. So unfortunately, we do see a lot of lines being hit on 17. And these are sort of some of the hot spots, both at Laurel Curve and up at Lexington Reservoir, where we see those lines consistently being hit. This is another example of some interesting behavior that we can identify with the GPS data. And so I had said that if there's consistently GPS points in the same location, we often go to those points and it tends to be a kill site. So where they're feeding on a deer, mountain lions tend to, if they make a deer kill, they'll feed on that deer for several days. And so they'll feed at night and then cover it up during the day. They'll cache it. So you might find a deer covered in a lot of leaves, still with some meat left on it, and that usually means the mountain lion has killed it and is going to come back the next night to continue feeding. But in this case, when we start to see this pattern that it almost looks like spokes on a wheel, where it's like going to the same central location, leaving, coming back, and it's continuing more than just 2 or 3 days, this is indicative of a den site. And so in this case, this is in Sierra Azul, and there's a collared female that is still a collared, and she, a few summers ago, had this den. And so when we start to see this, we can go to those den sites and record how many kittens she has, and also monitor kitten survival. And you'll notice about halfway through the animation that the den site moves, and that's pretty typical as well. Well, they'll stay at a particular location for about a month, and then she'll physically move those kittens one by one, lifting them up in her mouth, going to a new den site, usually just a couple 100 meters away. But we think it's a strategy to keep those kittens safe from other predators. And then this is sort of what those dens look like. So they're not dens in the sense that as we think of dens like with bears, they tend to just be really densely covered areas with a lot of understory. Usually it's a lot of just really thick poison oak. And so getting to them is particularly challenging. The video. And you'll notice that when the kittens are young, they're spotted. They also have clear blue eyes, which you can't tell here. But those spotted patterns help with their camouflage. And then at about 6 months, 6 to 8 months, they'll start losing those patterns and they'll turn into sort of the solid beige color. And so this kitten data is really helpful to understand the reproductive behavior of lions, and also to understand population dynamics. So we can understand both the birth rates and the death rates, and we can come up with sort of these, we call them source sink dynamics. So where in the Santa Cruz Mountains is the population growing? Where do we see the sort of the sink locations? That's where we see higher mortality than relative to births. And so we've been able to plot that and sort of see it spatially throughout the Santa Cruz system. And so this is kind of a lot of data, but on the right-hand side, we see the population growth rate, and that's really what we're concerned about. So all the locations in yellow, or especially that gold color, have a growth rate above 1. So in those locations, we think of them as source locations. These are places where mountain lions are giving birth. And then we see higher rates of mortality in the blue locations, which, as we would expect, lines up with the more urban areas. So next, I want to go through some of our current research. A lot of that is sort of related to or what I've previously talked about is sort of our ongoing research and some of the stuff we've done in the past. And this is sort of what's ongoing. This includes some of my own PhD work and then some of the sort of future directions of our project. The first of which is the effects of recreation. And so that's particularly relevant, perhaps, when we think about state parks and visitors to state parks. And so we've been lucky enough to work with Strava, which is a popular fitness application that people have on their phones. It's particularly popular amongst mountain bikers. And so a lot of the folks nearby here in Henry Cowell on Highway 9 will record their ride. And essentially it keeps track of where they are and where they are on specific trails. And then we can use that data to get an estimate of how many people are on trails. And then we can correspond that to whether or not a mountain lion is using that area. And so we can really characterize these interactions between people and lions on landscape, and understand how recreation is affecting mountain lion behavior. And so we've started to do this. This is, again, this plot is like maybe not the most fun to look at, but on our x-axis, so down on the bottom half of the screen, you're looking at recreation intensity. So as we move from left to right, we can think about locations that have like more recreation on the landscape. And then our response variable, so on the y-axis, moving up and down, this is how these lions are responding to people. And so on the bottom left of this plot are lions that are exposed to low levels of recreation, and they show a really strong avoidance of people. And so sort of as our example, we have 114 written in here. She's actually the same female that I showed denning in one of the previous slides. She lives in Sierra Azul and really rarely comes into contact with people. So there's not a lot of recreationists going into Sierra Azul. There's a relatively small trail network in there. And what we see as a result is that she is strongly avoiding people. And we sort of see this trend where the cats that are more exposed to people are more tolerant of people. And I think that makes sense in that, in a way, they're forced to be. And so on the far right of this plot, we see 25F. She's no longer around, but she was collared for a long time on our project, and she lived in Wilder and was frequently on UCSC campus and sort of in the heart of Wilder. And so she was exposed to the highest level of recreation of any of the collared cats that we've monitored. Um, and what we saw is that she's fairly tolerant of people. And so people, or at least when we look at the recreation data, we see that people are consistently getting close to her, and that she wasn't fleeing from those places. She was still using those trails. Um, and again, this may be a thing of necessity where there's not a lot of space for her to move in wilder that doesn't have people. And so in general, this is sort of our takeaway that as lions are more and more exposed to recreation, they tend to, you can think about it almost in terms of habituation. They may be habituating where they're getting more used to people. They're allowing people to get closer, and they're using those same trails that people are using. Some of our other work has to do with questions regarding really keeping whether it's spatial or temporal, but keeping a separation between recreationists and mountain lions. And so if we see this trend towards habituation, it doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. I actually think it's positive in that it contributes to coexistence and doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. But we've been working with Midpen and some of the parks sort of in the South San Jose or South Bay area to look at different ways that we can help keep that separation between people and lions. And so we're sort of investigating two different routes or two different avenues in terms of what this might look like. One is using dogs as we would to collar lions. But we know that mountain lions are afraid of dogs, and we also know that they're afraid of human voices. So some of our previous work has shown if you play a recording of people talking, those mountain lions will flee that area. And so we're kind of combining those two observations. We're using dogs, and then we're also playing human voice recordings out of a speaker. We're trying to scare these mountain lions farther away from trails, not necessarily out of their home range, not necessarily for long periods of time, but the idea is that we get them to associate human voices with trails, and then they learn to avoid those areas, particularly when there's high human presence. The other thing that we're looking into is the use of forested fuel breaks. And so throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains, we have more and more of these areas where the understory is being thinned to help lower or lessen fuel loads. This tends to be not ideal mountain lion habitat. They want cover, and so that understory is important as they move through the landscape. It makes them feel safe. We see that that's sort of where they're denning and where they tend to use or spend more of their time. And so one thing that we're now looking into is can we use these to our advantage, and can we put these fuel breaks close to high use trails, and essentially lessen the favorability of the habitat near those trails, to make it less likely that mountain lions are just sitting near that trail and bedding down during the day, and potentially then be coming into contact with people. So that's sort of ongoing work. And ultimately, it's all an attempt to have non-lethal alternatives for when there are encounters, or to help prevent future encounters. And so this is really like pushing towards a coexistence model where we can have both recreation and mountain lion presence. And then lastly, this is some work from another PhD student in our lab, and he is looking at adding these small devices to the side of the collar that will help give us more insight into what each animal is doing. And so these are really small recording devices, or essentially audio recorders, and they're recording continuous sound of that mountain lion. And so we can sort of get at two different things with these devices. One is we can help distinguish behaviors. So I had said that we use these accelerometers and the GPS data to understand what each mountain lion is doing. Sometimes those signatures or those signals are like hard to distinguish and differentiate. And so by adding the audio device, we can then listen in on what the mountain lion's doing. And this is particularly helpful for things like feeding, and really getting a sense of what they're doing. The second thing we can use these for is sort of this idea of a soundscape. And so we can understand how a mountain lion behaves in the different contexts. So as they're exposed to higher levels of human sounds, really, how does that shift their behavior? So that's sort of still to come. And then I finally just wanted to wrap up with some of our main takeaways and our sort of our reiterate some of the goals of our project. But the first takeaway is just that mountain lions really do play an important part in our ecosystem, and the presence is important not only for maintaining deer populations, but also for the larger ecological context of lots of different species. And then we also see that human activity has a huge effect on behavior. And so whether that's recreation, housing density, roads, all of these different forms of human activity are really changing the behaviors of mountain lions on the landscape. And that's something that we continue to study, and really that this Santa Cruz system lends itself well to studying because we have this big diversity of human disturbance. And then lastly is just, I want to reiterate that connectivity is really important, whether we're thinking about it at the sort of at the local level with Highway 17, at the statewide level, connecting different populations, or at the national or transnational continental scale, being able to connect different populations is essential to their long-term persistence and survival. So hopefully I didn't take up too much time. That's all I have for the presentation, and I'm happy to chat and talk about or answer questions and anything else.